Hello everyone. This is part 3 of the how to build a login and registration system for Android applications video series. This is the final part of this series where I show you how to implement the activities needed for the application and how to put the finishing touches and then test this application. So without further delay, let's get into it. So we're going to start out by coding out the register activity. So if you haven't made an activities package yet, I encourage you to do so. So package and just make a packages activities. And then inside it, create a login activity and registration activity, both Java classes. And on the onCreate method, what we're doing is we're setting the layout to activity register. Don't worry, I'll cover this later on. And we have database helper instance, which we covered in last video. We'll be using this to help with various database transactions. Now we have the login registration buttons along with the required fields. So username, password, email, confirm password, first name and last name. And then registration button has an on-click listener, and so does login button. But part of the registration activities on the on-click button is incomplete, so we'll do that now. So I left a portion of the code blank just so I could code along and then explain what I'm doing as I'm going. That way you can learn as well. So what we're doing here is we're checking if any of the fields above are empty. If they're empty, then we just go to the else statement. But if they're not empty, then we proceed. So over here, what we're doing is we're creating a toast statement, and we're saying that if any of these fields are empty, we want this toast message to be shown, which is basically saying just fill in all the details, please, for the end user. If they are true, if they're not empty, then we can proceed with the registration process. And that entails sending the data to a method called insert data. So here we have last name, and then we make a toast message saying, actually, no, this should be, yeah, so now we make a insert data call, and we call the insert data the method. Now this, I will get to this after. First, we have to also implement the logic for the login button as well. So the login is basically just using a basic intent. An intent is something that you want to do in Android. So it's an action. In this case, we want this intent to navigate the user from the registration activity, which they're currently on, to the login activity upon clicking the login button. And then we say start activity intent. Okay, so pretty simple. Next, we can move on to the insert data method. In the insert data method, we're starting out by confirming that we have indeed all of these fields, and we're setting a new user object. We're creating a new user object using these fields. Now, before persisting this new user object to the database, we need to confirm that the confirm password matches the input password. If it does, we then need to hash our password. So whenever storing a password in a database, you should never do it as a plain text, meaning you shouldn't store it in the original format it was received in. You should always hash it. The reason for doing so is if the database gets hacked, the attacker will not be able to interpret what the password actually is because it's hashed. So in order to hash, we also need something called a salt. So a salt is something that you add to the hashing algorithm to produce a unique hash that can never be decrypted. So a hash can never be decrypted. It can only go one way. So you can only go from plain text to a hash, and you need the salt to compare the inputted password. So this is kind of getting ahead, but in the login functionality, you need the input password and the stored salt, which you can apply to that input password to find the hash. That hash will then be compared to the hash in the database, and if those two match, you know that the user entered the same password. But to bring it back to the registration method we have here. Yeah, so what we're doing is we have password salt, and we're using the bcrypt library for the hashing functionality. And if you're looking for the dependency, I'll include a link to my GitHub repository for this application, and you can look in the build.gradle file. It's right here. So it's called mind.jbcrypt, and you just have to install that, and bcrypt should be working. So now we're using a hash password uh, method from bcrypt, and we're applying the salt that we generated up here. So now string hashed password is the actual hashed password. And now we're setting the password of the new user to that hash password. We're also setting password salt to whatever was randomly generated. Now we call the database helper. And we also need app database. And then we say get database and we pass get application context. So we're creating a database instance. And as you can guess, what we're about to do is store this user instance in the database using the DAO class. So if database is not null, we're going to use get user DAO, get the user DAO class. Then we say insert user, and we pass in the new user. So insert user into the database table user if all these conditions are met. Password is matching to confirm password. We hash the password, assigned it to the password field, and if if the database instance was unable to be created, then what we do is, oh, sorry, this is not in this loop. So this is over here. So if the password does not match confirm password, then we say password does not match confirm password. Please try again. Something like that. And since this is quite lengthy, we use toast long. So this is just an arbitrary length for the toast message. And in order to show it, we have to use the show method. Now we have our insert data method built. So now that this is built, we can move on to the login activity. So the login activity is dependent on the registration activity, because without a registered user, there won't be any users to log in. So in the login activity, most of it is been completed. So most of the trivialities have been completed. We're just finding a view. So the layout I will cover next, so don't worry about that. We're just using the IDs to assign these instances, these view instances. Then we're going to create a SQLite database instance. And the way we do that is by saying database helper and session in this. And we're also instantiating session manager. If the session manager shows that we are indeed logged in, then we go from login activity to the main activity. Because if you are logged in, there is no need to stay in the login page. You can just directly go to the main activity. And then if not, then you can proceed to the login. You could stay on the login activity. And then we're going to initialize username field and input password field. So what these fields in this initialize method is doing is we're just setting the click listeners for the login and registration buttons. So for the login button, once the user clicks the login button, we want to get the text in the username field to string, and then we're going to trim it in case of any excess white space at the end or at the beginning to make it easy or more fail-safe. And we're also going to trim the password. If username is not null and password is not null, then we call login process, passing in username and password. If they are null, then we create a toast message. Something like that. Toast, get long, and then show. So that's basically it for the login. Next, for the registration, we just have a simple intent. So if the user clicks the registration button in the login page, then that user wants to navigate to the registration page. Therefore, we have login activity, which is the current activity, and the activity you want to go is register activity. And then we say start activity intent, and there we go. So now we can move on to the login process. First, we'll create dialog fragment. This will be used as the loading screen. And we're going to say show dialog logging in. Then we're going to instantiate. And the reason we need a loading screen is It's just a visual effect. Once a user clicks the login button for half a second, the login screen will appear, and it's just a darker version of the current screen, and then the result would appear. Now we have database helper. Database helper, get application context, string. And now what we're doing here is we're getting database helper. We're getting the stored hashed password of this user that is about to log in. Granted that we can find that user in the database. So if the user does not have an entry in the database, then this password would return null because we just don't have any data. So they would have to actually go and register before they could use the login page. But if they are registered, if they come to the database, the login page, and go through this click login, we will query the database using their username as a where clause. Then we'll get their hashed password and store it in stored user password. So once we have this, this is very useful because it'll be used to authenticate the user. So after we get that, we also need the password salt. So this is where those enums I talked about in the last video comes in handy, because now you can constrain the number of inputs uh, so that everything is so organized, right? There's only a limited number of inputs that can go. And since we inputted password salt, it's again using the username as a querying option, finding that user and getting the salt. So once we get the salt, if stored user password is not null, so we do a null check. If it is not null, then we can proceed. Sorry, I must have missed something here. So first we need a schedule, and we're using timer task. And this is used to create the login screen. So usually if we didn't do this, it would go right away into the result, but we don't want that. We want there to be a half-second pause. And the way we do that is by using the timer.schedule method. And over here, we're going to specify the delay, and it's in milliseconds. So half a second would be 500 milliseconds. And now we have message. We have if stored user password is not null. So now we do the null check inside string hashed input password. So we're going to hash that password, the input password, in other words, the new password, using the exact same salt that was saved in the user tables user instance. The reason we use the same salt is because we want to be able to compare those hashes. And it's only if we use the same salt that was used to register that we can, that the hashes will be identical. Otherwise, the hashes won't match, even when the plain text passwords do match. So it's important to store the salt. So if hashed input password equals user password. So here's the big validation. Then we say the message login successful. So if the hash user password equals the stored user password, In other words, the users inputted the same password that was stored in the database table, then the login attempt is successful. If not, we say login failed, please try again. And then we have a string called final message. It's going to be assigned after message. And then login activity, this run on UI thread. So you might be wondering what this run on UI thread does. So let me just type this out so it's clear. Here we're making a toast message. Now note that the reason we need run on UI thread instead of just having make text for toast is because we can't run a toast message on a worker thread. So basically when we said new timer schedule and then caused a half-second delay and then we're running this method, what we're doing is we're not running this method on the main thread. We're running it on a separate worker thread. But the thing is, we can't display toast messages using a worker thread. We need to run that on the main thread. But in order to overcome this pitfall, what we're going to do is login activity.this run on UI thread, which means we're going to run that toast message on the UI thread after that delay. So that's why run on UI thread is needed. Okay, and then we say show. And that's basically it. And we can delete this one. Okay, so that's basically it for login. There's a few more things I need to show. So I'll briefly go over registration and login XML files. Typing this out by hand would be really tedious. So what I've done is I've included the GitHub application source code in the description along with the corresponding blog post, which has that XML file so you can copy and paste. Let me give you a broad view, design view uh, snapshot. So here's what it looks like. Registration page, it's just asking for username, password, email, first name, last name, confirm password, and then register login. And then in login activity, if we go to the design tab, username, password, login, and then forgot password. So pretty simple, nothing complicated. And I should also cover activity main. So in the main activity, it's just two buttons. You have the login and the sign up. The sign up is another name for the registration activity. And this is gonna redirect the user to the register activity on click. And I will cover main activity later. Actually, I will cover it next. So yeah, so just get the XML files from my GitHub repo. And once you get that, we can code out the main activity. So you can see I've already done some stuff here. So we're setting the activity to main. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention here. In activity, login activity, make sure activity login, make sure that you're setting the right content view. So if your if your layout is called activity login, then make sure it's activity login. Over here, it's activity main. We're getting the buttons, login button, sign up button. Then we assign a click listener to that. And what we're basically doing is just a simple intent. And we're going to take the user from the main activity class to the login activity class. And then we say start activity intent. Intent. So the same thing here. It's basically intent and activity this star activity, star activity, and intent. So we've just set up the click listeners, and notice finally we have the database create database method. So once the application loads, we want the database to be created, and we want that to be created by running the following migrations specified in add migrations, and we want it to be allowed to be run on the main thread. So that's basically it as far as the application goes. Some little things that you might have to look into is make sure your Android manifest file has these activities. So by default, it's going to have main activity as its entry point. Now you'll need to add activities login and then activities register activity while setting the exported field to true for both in order for Android to know what these are, the existence of these activities, and how to use them. So once you have that, you should be good. And again, you might be missing some dependencies. So I have some custom dependencies here. So asset Sqlite OpenHelper, JDBcrypt, JBcrypt, room compiler. These you can get from my GitHub repo and my blog post. So once you have that, you can run the application and see how it actually works. So let me bring you a working instance. Um, so first, let's register. So let's say tester2. And I apologize if the registration, the layout is out of place. I haven't had much time to set the constraints in an organized way. So it's kind of out of place, but oops. Okay. So yeah, so tester2 email tester2 at gmail.com. I haven't included any fancy validations for the email, but we have done so for the password, at least the like checking the similarities. Once we have account set up, we click on register and we see the pop-up registration successful. Now we can go to login, and I want to try something very random. Uh, Login failed, please try again. You can see another message popping up. That's because we also put another message. We should probably take that out. So now we enter the registered user that we just created, and we see it login successful. So you can see how the page goes dark, and that's because of progress bar dialog and the fragment that we're using for that effect. So I hope that made things clear and you learned something from this tutorial series. If you did, please make sure to like and subscribe. And yeah, thank you so much for watching my videos. And if you have any criticisms or comments, please include them in the video description. I will include the application GitHub link along with my corresponding blog post series in the video description. So stay tuned for that. And till next time, have a great day.